Look at this single crumpled dollar bill. In today's economy, it's practically useless. You can't even buy a bottle of water with it at a gas station. But imagine if I told you that this same piece of paper was once a golden ticket to a three-course feast. Close your eyes and step back into 1965. The air smells like hairspray and sizzling griddle grease. The radio is playing the Beatles, and you are sliding onto a spinning red vinyl stool at the most iconic spot in town, Woolworth's. This wasn't just a store, it was the heartbeat of the 60s. For less than $1, you were getting a towering turkey club, a heap of fries, and a hand-scooped milkshake that was so thick the straw would collapse. It sounds impossible, almost like a fever dream compared to the prices we pay today. But how did they do it? How did Woolworths manage to serve high-quality comfort food for pennies on the dollar? And more importantly, why did this delicious empire completely vanish just as the culture wars of the 60s heated up? The answer isn't just about economics, it's about a shift in the American soul. Before we reveal the secret behind the menu, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to receive more stories like this one. Now, let's grab a menu and see what we can afford. To truly understand the magic of the Woolworths lunch counter, you have to physically transport yourself back to a Saturday afternoon in 1964. You walk through those heavy glass doors, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of merchandise, but a very specific, unforgettable atmospheric cocktail. It is a sensory collision of roasting nuts, cheap floral perfume from the cosmetics counter, ozone from the lighting, and the savory, unmistakable scent of griddle grease wafting from the back. That smell was the siren song of the American middle class. It didn't smell like fast food as we know it today, processed and plastic. It smelled like a home kitchen that had been scaled up to feed an army. You weren't just walking into a store. You were entering the town square of the 20th century, a place where the air conditioning was always freezing cold, a luxury in itself, and the chrome was polished to a mirror finish that reflected the optimism of the era. You make your way past the aisles of sewing patterns and 45 RPM records, heading straight for the serpentine counter that winds through the center of the store like a red and silver river. Finding a seat was a competitive sport in the 60s. You had to hover, eyeing the patrons, waiting for someone to wipe the last crumbs of a biscuit from their mouth so you could slide onto that spinning red vinyl stool. And that stool is important. It wasn't a rigid chair, it was a pivot point. You could spin left to talk to your neighbor about the space race or the new Ford Mustang, or spin right to flag down a waitress. It was a democratic seating arrangement, where a bank manager in a three-piece suit might be eating a grilled cheese next to a teenager spending his lawn mowing money. Once you claimed your territory on the counter, you were presented with a menu that felt less like a list of options and more like a challenge to your appetite. The star of the show, the undisputed king of the Woolworths culinary empire, was the turkey club sandwich. In modern times, a club sandwich is often a sad, flattened affair with processed deli meat. But in the mid-60s at Woolworths, this thing was an architectural marvel. It was a triple-decker skyscraper of toast, held together by the structural integrity of frilly-tipped toothpicks. We are talking about real turkey, roasted in the kitchen, hand-sliced thick, layered with crisp iceberg lettuce that actually crunched, tomatoes that tasted like they came from a garden rather than a laboratory, and bacon that was fried right in front of you. And the mayonnaise, generous, creamy, and applied with a spatula, not a squeeze bottle, the price for this monument to gluttony, usually around 65 cents. It creates a sort of cognitive dissonance when you think about it now. You could slap a single dollar bill on the Formica counter, devour a meal that would cost $20 in a modern bistro, and still get enough change back to buy a comic book or a pack of gum on your way out. But the club wasn't the only legend. There was the baked apple dumpling, a dessert so popular that some branches reportedly sold out before noon. These weren't frozen pastries shipped from a warehouse in a cardboard box. They were often baked on site or locally sourced, served warm in a pool of heavy cream or a scoop of vanilla ice cream that began to melt the second it hit the warm crust. The contrast of hot and cold, the texture of the sugar, it was simple, unpretentious, and absolutely perfect. This brings us to the F.W. Woolworth special, the roast beef dinner. Imagine walking into a discount store today and ordering a roast beef dinner with mashed potatoes, gravy, and peas. You wouldn't do it. You would be terrified. But in 1965, This was standard procedure. The gravy was dark and rich, the potatoes were peeled by human hands, and the beef was tender. This quality was possible because Woolworths operated on a philosophy that has largely gone extinct. The idea that the lunch counter wasn't just a profit center, but a magnet. They didn't mind breaking even on the food, because they knew that once you were full of roast beef and dopamine, you were much more likely to wander the aisles and buy a new paring knife, a bottle of shampoo, or a bag of toy soldiers. The food was the hook, and the store was the net. If you are enjoying this trip down memory lane and want to receive more stories like this one, exploring the lost empires of our past, please take a second to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps us keep the grill hot and the stories coming. Now we have to talk about the beverages, because you couldn't wash down a triple-decker club with just tap water. The Woolworth soda fountain was a chemistry lab of joy. The Coca-Cola didn't come from a plastic bottle. It came from a syrup pump mixed with carbonated water right before your eyes, often with a squirt of vanilla or cherry syrup added for free if you knew the waitress. But the real heavy hitter was the milkshake. In the 1960s, a milkshake was a meal replacement. It was served in a tall fluted glass, but the best part was the metal mixing tin that the waitress would leave next to your glass. That tin always held the dividend, the extra half shake that didn't fit in the glass. It felt like winning the lottery every single time. It was thick, rich, and required significant lung capacity to pull through the paper straw. The people serving this food were just as iconic as the menu items. The Woolworth girls were a legion of waitresses in pastel uniforms with white aprons and sensible shoes, who possessed an uncanny ability to memorize 6 orders at once while simultaneously brewing a fresh pot of coffee. They spoke a diner lingo that is slowly fading from the American lexicon, shouting burn one for a burger or draw one for a coffee. They were the conductors of this chaotic symphony, moving with a rhythm that matched the fast-paced energy of the 60s. In an era before smartphones, people watched the staff work as a form of entertainment. You watched the grill cook flip burgers, you watched the soda jerk pull the tap, and you watched the world go by through the plate glass windows. This high-quality, low-cost model created a specific rhythm of life. Teenagers would rush there after school, pooling their change for a plate of fries to share. Secretaries would descend in a flock at noon for egg salad sandwiches. It was a place of comfort in a decade that was becoming increasingly turbulent. While the Beatles were changing music and the space race was changing the sky, Woolworths remained a constant, reliable anchor where a dollar was still a king. But hidden beneath the sizzling bacon and the clinking silverware, there was a subtle shift happening. The sheer volume required to keep prices this low was immense, and the world outside those glass doors was beginning to speed up. The rise of the suburbs and the car culture was just starting to threaten the downtown walking traffic that Woolworths depended on. Yet, in the mid-60s, sitting at that counter, you wouldn't have noticed the storm clouds gathering. You would only notice that your grilled cheese was perfectly golden, the radio was playing the Beach Boys, and for one glorious hour, everything was right with the world. But to understand how this empire collapsed, we first have to look at the secret economics that made that 65-cent sandwich possible and the hidden cost that was slowly bleeding the company dry. To understand the invisible machinery that kept those prices at rock bottom, you have to peel back the layers of nostalgia and look at the sheer industrial might of the F.W. Woolworth Company in the mid-1960s. While you were enjoying that 65-cent turkey club, you were actually participating in one of the most sophisticated supply chain experiments of the 20th century. Woolworths wasn't just a retailer. By the 1960s, they were essentially one of the largest restaurant chains in the world, even if they didn't label themselves as such. They possessed a buying power that would make modern giants tremble. When Woolworths decided to put chicken salad on the menu for a specific week, they weren't buying chickens by the crate. They were buying entire flocks. They moved mountains of poultry, rivers of gravy, and silos of flour. This economy of scale allowed them to dictate prices to suppliers in a way that the local mom-and-pop diners simply couldn't compete with. The local diner paid retail prices for their ingredients. Woolworths paid wholesale prices that were practically criminal. This massive operational scale meant that the lunch counter was designed with the precision of a Ford assembly line. The kitchen layout in the 1960s was a masterclass in efficiency, designed to minimize the steps a waitress had to take between the toaster, the ice cream scoop, and the customer. Every second saved was a penny earned. The Blue Plate Special wasn't just a cute name, it was a tactical inventory management tool. If the store had an overstock of roast beef from the previous day, it became the next day's shepherd's pie or open-faced sandwich. Nothing was wasted. The bone was boiled for broth, the crusts were used for stuffing, and the fat was rendered for frying. It was a closed loop of culinary efficiency that allowed them to maintain that $1 price point even as inflation began to creep up in the latter half of the decade. But as the 60s progressed, a new menacing shadow began to stretch across the gleaming linoleum floors of Woolworth's, a shadow cast not by a competitor in the department store game, but by the changing geography of America itself. The mid-60s saw the explosion of the suburbs. The white flight from city centers was draining the downtown districts where Woolworth's had built its empire. The customers who used to walk past the store every day on their way to work were now driving past it on new interstate highways, heading towards sprawling shopping malls that were shiny, new, and devoid of the old-world charm. And with the car culture came a new predator, the Golden Arches. McDonald's and other fast food joints were beginning to pop up on every corner, offering a burger for 15 cents. Sure, it wasn't the high-quality, fresh-roasted turkey of Woolworth's, and you had to eat it in your car or at a plastic table, but it was fast. Woolworth's was slow fast food. It required you to sit, wait, order, eat, and pay. In the hyper-accelerated culture of the late 60s, time was becoming more valuable than the food itself. However, the true conflict, the twist that would forever alter the legacy of the Woolworth's lunch counter, wasn't about profit margins, supply chains, or hamburgers. It was about the soul of the nation. We look back at these counters with rose-tinted glasses, imagining a happy, unified America sharing milkshakes. But the reality of the 1960s lunch counter was that it became the front line of a war. In the southern United States, that inviting red vinyl stool was forbidden territory for Black Americans. They could shop in the store, they could buy the thread, the toys, and the toothpaste, but they could not sit at the counter to eat the food. They were relegated to a standing section or a takeout window. This segregation was a poison pill hidden inside the sweet nostalgia of the era. The revelation came crashing down on February 1st, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the ripples of that day defined the entire decade for the company. 4 young black college students sat down at the Woolworth's lunch counter and politely asked for service. They were refused, but instead of leaving, they stayed. They sat there until the store closed. The next day, more came. Then more. This wasn't just a protest. It was a siege on the very concept of the public space. The Woolworth's lunch counter, designed to be the most democratic place in the store where anyone with $1 could eat, was exposed as a lie. Suddenly, the smell of griddle grease and roasting turkey was mixed with the tension of impending violence. The images that flashed across TV screens in the 60s weren't of happy families eating banana splits. They were images of students sitting stoically on those stools while angry mobs poured ketchup, sugar, and hot coffee over their heads. They were spat on, beaten, and arrested, all while the Woolworth girls stood frozen behind the counter, caught between company policy and human decency. The lunch counter had transformed from a place of comfort into a stage for the civil rights movement. The midpoint twist of the Woolworth story is that its greatest historical significance isn't the food it served, but the service it refused. This created a massive corporate crisis for F.W. Woolworth. The company was paralyzed. In the North, they were integrated. In the South, they followed local segregation laws. But the national protests and boycotts that followed the sit-ins forced their hand. The picket lines outside the stores in New York and Chicago were hurting the bottom line just as much as the empty stools in the South. The illusion of the happy, wholesome gathering place was shattered. You couldn't enjoy your 65-cent club sandwich if there was a line of picketers outside shouting for justice. The food tasted different when you knew that the person standing next to you wasn't allowed to sit down. By July of 1960, Woolworth's caved and desegregated its counters, but the damage to the innocent image of the lunch counter was done. The cultural vibration of the space had changed. It was no longer just a place to get a cheap meal. It was a place where history had happened, where the ugly underbelly of American society had been exposed under the bright fluorescent lights. As the decade wore on, the lunch counter struggled to regain its carefree identity. The innocence of the early 60s, the Beatles, the milkshakes, the spinning stools, gave way to the heavy, complex reality of the late 60s, Vietnam, assassinations, and riots. And while the company tried to pivot, trying to keep the focus on the jumbo banana split and the harvest turkey special, the economics were beginning to crumble from the inside out. The labor costs were rising. The waitresses, who had been the backbone of the operation, were demanding better wages, and rightfully so. The loss leader strategy, losing money on food to sell merchandise, started to fail because people were coming in, eating the cheap food, and then leaving to buy their merchandise at the new, cheaper big-box competitors like Kmart, which were aggressive and expanding rapidly. The symbiotic relationship between the lunch counter and the retail floor was breaking. The counter was becoming a parasite on the store rather than a magnet. Yet even as the storm clouds gathered, the food remained stubbornly, defiantly good. It was almost as if the kitchen staff was working harder to preserve the quality, to keep the magic alive through the sheer force of culinary will. The gravy was still rich, the cakes were still moist, and for $1 you could still feel like a king, even if the kingdom around you was slowly starting to rust. But the executives in the Woolworth building in New York were looking at the ledgers, and the red ink was starting to flow as freely as the ketchup. They began to whisper about modernization, a word that usually spells the death of tradition. They started looking at the lunch counter, not as the heart of the store, but as a problem to be solved. And the solution they were cooking up would fundamentally change the experience, stripping away the very charm that made it legendary. The corporate response to the changing tides of the 1960s was a phenomenon that would eventually suffocate the very charm they were trying to save: modernization. In the boardrooms of the Woolworth building, far removed from the smell of frying bacon and the clatter of ceramic plates, executives stared at charts that showed a terrifying trend. The profit margins on the food were vanishing. The cost of labor, ingredients, and rent was skyrocketing, while the customer's expectation of a $1 meal remained frozen in stone. To the suits in New York, the lunch counter was no longer the heart of the store. It was a bleeding artery. Their solution was to declare war on the inefficiency of the human touch. They began to implement systems designed to strip the slow out of the slow fast food model, and in doing so, they inadvertently began to surgically remove the soul of the establishment. This shift manifested physically with the introduction of the Harvest House and Red Grill concepts in the mid to late 60s. These were attempts to rebrand the lunch counter for a new space-age generation. The cozy, serpentine counters, with their intimate elbow-rubbing proximity, were slowly ripped out in favor of cafeteria-style lines and booth seating. The psychology of the space shifted dramatically. At the old counter, you were a guest being served by a host. In the new cafeteria lines, you were a unit of processing, pushing a plastic tray along a stainless steel rail, sliding past sneeze guards that separated you from the food. The interaction with the Woolworth girl was reduced to a transactional grunt at the cash register at the end of the line. The democratic theater of the spinning stool, where you could converse with the stranger next to you, was replaced by the isolation of the high-backed booth. You were no longer eating with the town. You were eating alone, surrounded by strangers. Simultaneously, a silent tragedy was unfolding in the kitchen. The obsession with speed and consistency, driven by the looming threat of McDonald's, meant that the era of scratch cooking was drawing to a close. The mid-60s saw the rise of the convenience food revolution. Food scientists had figured out how to dehydrate, freeze, and preserve almost anything, and Woolworths, desperate to cut labor costs, embraced this new chemistry with open arms. The potatoes, once peeled by hand in the back room by a prep cook who knew the exact ratio of butter to milk, were replaced by boxes of instant flakes that tasted vaguely of cardboard and salt. The gravy, which used to be the rich, complex lifeblood of the roast beef dinner, born from the drippings of the meat itself, became a powder mixed with hot water. It was smooth, it was brown, and it was hot. but it lacked the history and the depth of the real thing. The Turkey Club, that architectural marvel we admired earlier, began to suffer from shrinkflation before the term even existed. The slices of turkey became thinner, more processed, pressed from meat slurry rather than carved from a bird. The tomatoes, bred for durability in shipping rather than flavor, arrived hard and pale. The magic was evaporating, replaced by efficiency. Yet, the prices remained deceptively low. You could still eat for $1 or maybe $1.25. But the value proposition was inverting. You weren't getting a $5 meal for $1 anymore. You were getting a 50-cent meal for $1. The customers, loyal as they were, began to taste the difference. That distinct Woolworth's taste, a mixture of love, grease, and fresh ingredients, was being replaced by the metallic tang of preservatives. Culturally, the lunch counter was becoming a strange anachronism, a bunker against the Cultural Revolution exploding outside the plate glass windows. By 1968 and 1969, the streets of America were filled with anti-war protests, psychedelic rock, and a youth culture that rejected the consumerist values of their parents. The Woolworths counter became a refuge for the silent majority. It was a place where the older generation, the World War II veterans and the housewives in their pillbox hats, could retreat to a world that still made sense to them. Inside Woolworths, it was still 1955. The music was still soft, the lighting was still bright, and the menu was still recognizable. It became a polarized space. To the hippie generation, Woolworths represented the establishment, the square world of mass production and conformity. To the older generation, it was the last fortress of decency. But a business cannot survive on nostalgia alone, especially when its core demographic is aging and the youth are spending their money elsewhere. The loss leader strategy, the economic engine that justified the cheap food, was also failing catastrophically. The theory, remember, was that you lose money on the burger to make money on the sewing machine. But the retail landscape of the late 60s had mutated. The rise of Kmart, Walmart, and huge suburban shopping malls meant that shoppers were becoming ruthless. They would come into Woolworths, eat the cheap food because it was still the best deal in town, and then walk right out the door to buy their household goods at Kmart for 20% less. Woolworths had essentially become a charity soup kitchen for the middle class, subsidizing the hunger of millions while their retail aisles gathered dust. The symbiotic relationship was broken. The host was feeding the parasite, and the parasite was no longer giving anything back. As the decade closed, the atmosphere inside the stores grew heavier. The bright, optimistic chrome of the early 60s began to tarnish. The maintenance budgets were cut, leading to flickering fluorescent lights and cracked vinyl seats that were patched with duct tape rather than replaced. The Woolworth girls, once the proud ambassadors of the brand, were now overworked and underpaid, dealing with a coarser, more impatient public. The intricate dance of the soda fountain jerk was gone, replaced by self-serve beverage stations. The clinking of heavy ceramic mugs was replaced by the crinkle of disposable paper cups. The sensory experience was dulling. The smell of fresh roasting nuts was overpowered by the smell of floor wax and stale air. The tragedy was that the executives couldn't see that the inefficiency was the product. People didn't go to Woolworths because it was the fastest way to get calories into their bodies. They went because it felt like home. By trying to compete with the speed of McDonald's and the prices of Kmart, Woolworths lost its identity. They were stuck in the middle, not fast enough to be fast food, not good enough to be a restaurant, and not cheap enough on the retail side to be a discounter. They were drifting into a dangerous no-man's land of commerce. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't just the food or the finances. It was the geography of the American dream. The downtowns were dying. The riots of the late 60s in major cities left scars on the urban landscape. Windows were boarded up and foot traffic plummeted. Woolworths, which had anchored Main Street USA for nearly a century, found itself anchored to a sinking ship. They tried to move into the malls, to replicate the magic in the windowless corridors of the suburban shopping centers, but it felt artificial. A lunch counter in a mall didn't have the same gravitational pull as a lunch counter that opened onto a bustling city sidewalk. It felt like a theme park recreation of a memory. As we approach the end of our story, we are left with a haunting image. A lone diner sitting at a modernized orange and brown booth in 1969, eating a plate of instant mashed potatoes and grey roast beef. The price is still low, but the cost is high. The vibrant, chaotic, delicious community hub of 1964 is gone, replaced by a corporate calculation. The empire is still standing, but the foundation has rotted away. The question now isn't if it will fall, but when. And when the end finally comes, it won't be with a bang, but with a quiet, heartbreaking liquidation sale. But before the lights go out forever, there is one final, devastating secret about the Woolworths legacy that we haven't touched on. The one thing that explains why, despite the decline, we still ache for that 65-cent sandwich today. The secret that haunts the legacy of Woolworths, the reason why a simple sandwich from 1965 still holds such a mythical grip on the American imagination, isn't about the mayonnaise, the turkey, or even the price tag. The devastating truth is that Woolworths was the last time a corporation truly loved you back. That sounds absurd in our modern age of algorithmic advertising and data mining, where every interaction is calculated to extract maximum value from your wallet. But in the mid-60s, that lunch counter operated on a fundamental social contract that has since been shredded. The secret ingredient was the third place. Sociologists talk about the first place, home, and the second place, work. But the third place is where community happens. For decades, Woolworths was the living room of America. It was a place where you didn't need a reservation. You didn't need to dress up, and you didn't need to be wealthy. You just needed $1 and an appetite. When that model collapsed under the weight of the changing 60s, we didn't just lose a cheap lunch, we lost our common ground. As the calendar flipped from 1969 to 1970, marking the end of the most turbulent decade in modern history, the Woolworths lunch counter stood as a tragic monument to a vanishing world. The physical spaces were still there. The chrome was a little pitted, the vinyl a little cracked, but the spirit had been evicted. The modernization we spoke of had turned these warm sanctuaries into sterile feeding troughs. The irony is heartbreaking. Just as the civil rights movement had successfully fought to make these counters open to everyone, the economic and cultural forces of the time conspired to make them irrelevant. The victory of integration was achieved just as the prize, the counter itself, began to rust. The shared experience of the blue plate special was replaced by the solitary confinement of the drive-through window. The car culture that exploded in the 60s promised freedom, but it delivered isolation. We traded the rubbing of elbows for the rolling up of windows. To truly feel the weight of this loss, imagine the sensory deprivation of the modern shopping experience compared to the sensory overload of a 1960s Woolworths. Today, you order from a kiosk or an app. You pick up a bag sealed with a tamper-proof sticker from a shelf. You interact with no one. But back then, the lunch counter was a theater of humanity. You watched the waitress, a woman who likely knew your name and your order, physically construct your meal. You saw the steam rise from the grill. You heard the clatter of heavy ceramic plates, plates that had weight, that felt permanent, unlike the styrofoam and paper of the coming decades. That heavy white mug of coffee represented stability. When you held it, you felt anchored to the earth. When Woolworths began to swap those ceramics for disposable plastics in a desperate bid to save pennies, they severed that anchor. They told the customer, implicitly, "You are no longer a guest, you are a transaction. Eat fast and get out." The death of the Woolworths lunch counter wasn't a sudden heart attack. It was a slow, agonizing starvation that began in the chaos of the late 60s and dragged on for another 30 years. But the fatal wound was inflicted in that decade. The decision to prioritize efficiency over connection, to chase the suburban dollar while abandoning the urban soul, created a zombie brand. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Woolworths sat there like a grand old ocean liner that had run aground, rusting on the beach while speedboats zipped by. The food became a punchline. The fresh roasted turkey became a rubbery slab of mystery meat. The baked apple dumpling became a microwaved puck of dough. The magic didn't just leave, it was actively chased away by accountants who couldn't quantify the value of a smile or the comfort of a familiar smell. When the final curtain eventually fell, long after the 60s ended, When the last Woolworth stores in the US closed their doors in 1997, it felt like the death of a grandparent you hadn't visited enough. The liquidation sales were grim affairs. People didn't come to buy the remaining inventory. They came to buy the fixtures. They bought the red vinyl stools. They bought the menu boards. They bought the soda fountain mixers. Why? Because they were trying to buy back a piece of their own innocence. They were trying to purchase a fragment of a time when a dollar bill was a magic carpet. Owning one of those stools was like owning a piece of the Berlin Wall. It was a physical artifact of a fallen empire. But you can't buy the atmosphere. You can put a red stool in your modern kitchen, but without the smell of the griddle, the sound of the Beatles on the radio, and the bustle of a 1965 downtown Saturday afternoon, it's just a chair. The legacy of the Woolworths lunch counter is a lesson in what we have sacrificed on the altar of convenience. We have better food now, arguably. We have more options. We have sushi in supermarkets and artisanal burgers on every corner, but we are hungrier than ever. We are starving for connection. We eat our meals while scrolling through phones, disconnected from the people sitting 3 feet away. The Woolworths counter forced you to look at your neighbor. It forced you to acknowledge the humanity of the person serving you. It was a place where the bank manager and the bus driver ate the same grilled cheese sandwich, and for 20 minutes they were equals. That equality, that shared caloric communion, is the best food that $1 could buy. It wasn't the nutrients in the turkey, it was the nourishment of the soul. So the next time you walk into a sterile, brightly lit fast food chain and tap your order onto a smudge-covered touchscreen, take a moment to close your eyes. Try to summon the phantom smell of roasting nuts and sizzling bacon. Try to hear the ghost of a waitress shouting, "Draw one," over the din of a bustling store. Remember that there was a time when commerce had a heartbeat, when value was measured in more than just profit margins, and when a single coin could buy you a seat at the table of American life. Woolworths is gone, buried under the asphalt of 1,000 parking lots, but the hunger for what it represented, warmth, belonging, and a fair deal, remains insatiable. The story of Woolworths is the story of us, how we changed, how we moved apart, and what we left behind in the rush toward the future. It is a reminder that sometimes the most expensive thing we lose is the thing that cost the least. If you want to keep exploring the lost worlds of our past and ensure these stories don't fade into the static of history, there is one simple thing you can do. Click that subscribe button right now. Join us and let's keep the memory alive together.